That iconic fruit hat and blinding smile were never about fashion. They were a cage. 20th Century Fox ruthlessly engineered Carmen Miranda into a racist caricature, banning her from speaking proper English, forcing her into bone-deforming shoes, and stripping away her humanity. To keep this money machine dancing, they pumped her full of stimulants, hooked her on sedatives, and even used electroshock therapy to reset her mind. This is the terrifying story of how Hollywood humiliated, exploited, and extracted a legend until she died. This is the true story of how a studio manufactured, drugged, and destroyed an icon. To understand what they took from her, we have to look at the authentic artist she was before Hollywood erased her identity. We must go back to the beginning, long before the machinery of American cinema turned a massive talent into a disposable product. The foundation of Carmen Miranda's life was not built on tropical movie sets. She was born Maria do Carmo Miranda da Cunha on February 9, 1909, in the northern Portuguese town of Marco de Canaveses. She was not even natively Brazilian. Her father, José Maria Pinto da Cunha, was a barber who emigrated to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, shortly after her birth in search of a better economic reality. Her mother, Maria Emilia Miranda, followed with young Maria and her sister a year later. They settled in the Lapa district of Rio de Janeiro. In the 1910s and 1920s, Lapa was the beating cultural heart of the city. It was a vibrant working-class neighborhood where Portuguese immigrants lived shoulder to shoulder with Afro-Brazilians. It was a place of extreme poverty, but it was also a crucible of musical innovation. The streets were filled with the sounds of coro and early samba, music born from the descendants of enslaved Africans. This was not the sanitized commercial music of the upper classes. It was raw, rhythmic, and deeply authentic. Young Maria do Carmo absorbed this environment entirely. She did not learn to sing in a sterile conservatory. She learned the syncopated rhythms and rapid-fire phrasing of samba by listening to the musicians playing in the local taverns and street corners of Lapa. Her family was strictly traditional and highly protective. Her father violently opposed any notion of his daughters entering the entertainment business, viewing it as a path to moral ruin. At the age of 14, Maria was pulled out of school to help support the struggling family. She took a job working in a local boutique making hats. There is a bitter, devastating irony in her first profession. Long before 20th Century Fox forced her to wear towering, spine-crushing headpieces loaded with artificial fruit, Maria was a skilled milliner, carefully crafting elegant hats for the wealthy women of Rio. While working at the boutique, she would sing constantly. Her voice was unique. It was not a booming, operatic soprano. It was a warm, agile mezzo-soprano, perfectly suited for the fast, conversational tempo of authentic samba. Customers noticed her talent. Local musicians noticed her talent. She began singing at small parties and local festivals, adopting the stage name Carmen in homage to Bizet's opera, a name she felt carried more dramatic weight than Maria. In 1929, at the age of 20, her trajectory shifted permanently. A local composer named Josue de Barros heard her sing at a charity event. He recognized immediately that Carmen possessed a rare, highly marketable quality. She bridged a massive cultural divide. She had the physical appearance of a respectable white European immigrant, but she sang with the authentic rhythm, cadence, and soul of Afro-Brazilian samba. In the racially stratified society of 1920s Brazil, this combination made her incredibly valuable. She could introduce the music of the working-class favelas to the wealthy elite without triggering the deep-seated prejudices of the era. De Barros brought her to a recording studio. In 1930, she recorded a song titled Tai, written by composer Gilberto de Carvalho. The impact of the record was instantaneous and unprecedented. It sold over 35,000 copies in its first year, an astronomical number for the Brazilian music market at the time. Carmen Miranda became a national sensation practically overnight. Throughout the 1930s, she was not an exotic novelty act. She was a legitimate, highly respected musical pioneer. She signed a contract with RCA Victor and became the undisputed queen of Brazilian radio. She starred in early Brazilian sound films, establishing herself as a formidable screen presence. Her phrasing was impeccable. She possessed the ability to deliver complex, rapid-fire lyrics with crystal-clear articulation, a skill that earned her the nickname the Dictator of Samba. She was a fiercely independent artist who negotiated her own contracts, demanded high salaries, and meticulously controlled her own public image. It was during this decade that she first adopted the Baiana look. Today, this outfit is heavily misunderstood, largely because Hollywood eventually warped it into a comedic uniform. But when Carmen Miranda first wore it in the 1939 Brazilian film Banana da Terra, it was a deliberate, respectful, cultural homage. The costume, featuring the turbans, the heavy necklaces, and the flowing skirts, was the traditional dress of the Afro-Brazilian women of Bahia, the street vendors who were the cultural custodians of samba. When Miranda wore the Baiana outfit, she was paying tribute to the roots of her music. The fruit in the turban was originally small, proportionate, and meant to represent the baskets of produce the Bahian women carried on their heads. It was a symbol of national pride, an assertion of Brazilian identity. By 1938, Carmen Miranda was the highest-paid entertainer in Brazil. She held court at the Urca Casino in Rio de Janeiro, the most glamorous elite entertainment venue in South America. She was a sophisticated, intelligent woman who moved comfortably among politicians, foreign dignitaries, and international celebrities. She had conquered her homeland entirely on her own terms, commanding respect not just for her charisma, but for her undeniable musical genius. But thousands of miles away, geopolitical forces were gathering that would soon rip her from her homeland and throw her into a corporate machine. In the late 1930s, the world was on the brink of the Second World War. As the conflict escalated in Europe, the United States government realized that its traditional overseas markets for trade and cultural exports were rapidly closing. The administration of President Franklin D. Roosevelt instituted the Good Neighbor policy, an aggressive diplomatic and economic initiative designed to secure the allegiance of Latin American nations and prevent the spread of fascist influence in the Western Hemisphere. The American entertainment industry, closely aligned with Washington's political objectives, was enlisted to help. Hollywood studios and Broadway producers were encouraged to incorporate Latin American themes and performers into their projects to foster cultural goodwill. In February 1939, a powerful Broadway impresario named Lee Schubert traveled to Rio de Janeiro, specifically looking for talent to import to the United States. He visited the Urca Casino and watch Carmen Miranda perform. Schubert did not understand the Portuguese lyrics. He did not grasp the cultural nuance of the baiana costume or the complex history of the samba rhythms. He simply saw a highly energetic, visually arresting woman who could captivate a room. He saw raw material that could be packaged and sold to a New York audience. Schubert offered her a contract to perform in a Broadway musical revue titled The Streets of Paris. The negotiations were a testament to Miranda's fierce independence. She refused to travel to the United States alone. She demanded that Schubert also hire her backing band, the Bando de Lua, insisting that American musicians would not be able to replicate the authentic rhythm of the samba. Schubert initially balked at the added expense, but Miranda held her ground. She would not compromise her music. Eventually, a wealthy Brazilian politician intervened, offering to subsidize the band's travel costs to ensure Brazil's biggest star could represent the nation on the world stage. On May 4, 1939, Carmen Miranda boarded the SS Uruguay, a luxury ocean liner bound for New York City. She stood on the deck, waving goodbye to the crowds that had gathered at the port of Rio de Janeiro to see her off. She was 30 years old, at the absolute peak of her artistic powers, and filled with the ambition to conquer a new continent. She believed she was traveling to the United States as a cultural ambassador, ready to share the authentic, sophisticated music of Brazil with the American public. She had no way of knowing that she was sailing directly into a psychological and physical trap. She was entirely unaware that the industry waiting for her in America had no interest in her authenticity, her intelligence, or her musical legacy. They were preparing to strip her of her identity, strap her into spine-crushing costumes, and lock her in a linguistic cage from which she would never escape. The brilliant, independent girl from Lapa was about to be dismantled, and the tragic era of the Brazilian bombshell was about to begin. When the SS Uruguay docked in New York Harbor in May 1939, Carmen Miranda stepped off the ship and immediately collided with the American media apparatus. She did not speak a word of English. Through an interpreter, she faced a barrage of journalists who had no context for her musical genius and no understanding of her cultural significance in Brazil. They did not ask her about the complex syncopation of samba or her record-breaking sales in Rio de Janeiro. They asked her about her vibrant clothes and her exotic appearance. It was the first subtle indicator of the total erasure she was about to endure. On June 19, 1939, she made her American debut in the Broadway musical revue The Streets of Paris at the Broadhurst Theater. Sharing the bill with established American comedic acts like Abbott and Costello, she was allotted only a brief window of stage time at the end of the first act. Backed by the authentic rhythms of her band, the Bando de Lua, she sang in Portuguese. The New York audience could not understand a single lyric, but the sheer kinetic force of her performance stopped the show. The critics were mesmerized, but their reviews were entirely devoid of musical critique. Instead, they relied heavily on condescending, exoticizing language. They called her the Brazilian bombshell. They described her as an explosive, fiery, untamed force of nature. In the eyes of the American press, she was no longer a sophisticated artist who meticulously arranged her own compositions. She was a novelty act. The Broadway run was a massive commercial success, and it did not take long for the ruthless, highly efficient machinery of Hollywood to notice the revenue she was generating. 20th Century Fox, operating under the dictatorial control of studio chief Darryl F. Zanuck, moved aggressively to acquire her. Zanuck saw the Broadway reviews and recognized a highly lucrative opportunity to exploit the United States government's good neighbor policy. With the outbreak of the Second World War closing off European markets, Hollywood studios were heavily incentivized by Washington to produce films that would appeal to South American audiences. Zanuck brought Miranda to Los Angeles in 1940 to star in the Technicolor musical Down Argentine Way. This film marked the exact moment 20th Century Fox began the systematic dismantling of her authentic identity. The studio had absolutely no interest in geographical or cultural accuracy. They were operating on a profoundly ignorant, monolithic view of Latin America. In their corporate calculus, everything south of the Texas border was simply one generic, colorful blur. They placed Miranda, a Brazilian artist whose entire musical identity was built on Afro-Brazilian samba, into a film explicitly set in Argentina. They surrounded her with actors performing watered-down versions of Cuban rumba and Argentine tango, while she sang in Portuguese. To the white American audiences Fox was targeting, the distinction did not matter. The studio deliberately flattened a vast continent of distinct, rich cultures into a single, highly marketable tropical caricature. With her ties to Brazil severed, Miranda had lost all leverage. She was financially responsible for her family and the members of her band, but she no longer had a homeland to retreat to if she refused the studio's demands. 20th Century Fox, operating under the ruthless calculus of studio chief Darryl F. Zanuck, recognized her newfound vulnerability and immediately capitalized on it. The caricature introduced in Down Argentine Way was no longer just a role. It became a mandatory, inescapable corporate uniform. She was now a captive property, and the studio executives mandated severe physical modifications to maximize her visual impact. Standing at 5 feet tall, Miranda had long utilized platform shoes in Brazil to command the stage. However, what began as a personal stylistic choice was weaponized by Fox directors. They mandated these towering 6 to 8 inch blocks of wood and cork as mandatory equipment for grueling, multi-day film shoots to share the screen with towering American leading actors. Miranda was contractually obligated to perform high-impact, rapid-fire dance routines wearing these massive blocks of wood and cork. The orthopedic toll of this mandate was devastating and entirely irreversible. The biomechanics of authentic samba require the dancer to stay light on their feet, executing fast, intricate steps and heavy hip movements. Attempting to execute this choreography while elevated on 8-inch platforms was a physical nightmare. Every time she executed a rapid step, a sudden stop, or a heavy spin on the soundstage, the kinetic shock wave traveled directly up through her feet, into her knees, and settled in her lower back. Over years of relentless filming, the footwear ravaged her body. It permanently deformed the metatarsal bones in her feet and caused severe chronic joint pain. She was quite literally crippling herself for the cameras. Simultaneously, the studio stripped her traditional Baiana outfit of its cultural reverence and mutated it into a grotesque spectacle. The original turbans worn by the street vendors of Bahia were modest, proportionate, and deeply symbolic. Fox turned this symbol of Afro-Brazilian heritage into a towering monolith of artificial bananas, pineapples, plastic grapes, and synthetic flowers. Balancing these massive, entirely unbalanced structures required extreme, constant muscular tension. She had to keep her neck rigidly straight to prevent the heavy artificial fruit from toppling over, while simultaneously moving her hips and shoulders with explosive energy. This unnatural posture caused severe strain on her cervical spine, leading to agonizing tension headaches and chronic neck spasms. Fox executives looked at the screening room rushes and saw an explosion of technicolor profitability. Her medical reality was one of permanent skeletal distress. However, the physical torture was only half the exploitation. 20th Century Fox also recognized that her sharp intellect threatened the comedic caricature they were selling. In Brazil, Miranda was a shrewd, highly capable businesswoman who negotiated her own contracts and meticulously curated her complex musical repertoire. When she arrived in America, it was her natural instinct to learn English to understand her legal documents and communicate meaningfully with her directors. In the standard operating procedure of the golden age of Hollywood, foreign actors like Greta Garbo or Ingrid Bergman were assigned elite vocal coaches to broaden their casting appeal, but Fox had a completely different set of rules for their South American import. Executives noticed that white American audiences laughed out loud when she stumbled over an English idiom or mispronounced a multisyllabic word. They realized a sharp, articulate Latina woman was potentially intimidating, but a linguistically incompetent caricature was comforting. It allowed the audience to feel a sense of cultural and intellectual superiority. Numerous accounts suggest studio executives aggressively pressured her to maintain her broken English persona, threatening her career trajectory if she dared to sound articulate. When she naturally began to pick up the language from living in Los Angeles, the studio aggressively halted her progress. Executives hauled her into their offices and delivered a blunt threat. They told her that her massive salary and her Hollywood residency depended entirely on maintaining her broken English accent. If she learned to speak correctly, she would lose her comedic value and they would cancel her visas, sending her back to the country that had just publicly rejected her. The psychological warfare extended directly to the sound stages. Screenwriters were instructed to draft scripts filled with malapropisms and grammatical errors. Directors forced her to intentionally mispronounce basic English words. If she delivered a line too clearly, the director called cut and forced her to sound more confused, more frantic, and more foreign. Studio publicists ensured she played the part off-screen, forcing her to tell reporters, "I say 20 words in English. I say money, 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 and I say hot dog." The American public consumed this performance with ravenous enthusiasm. They laughed uproariously in the movie theaters. But they were not laughing with her. They were laughing at her. The cognitive dissonance required to survive this daily routine was staggering. She possessed the sharp intelligence to fully understand the mechanics of the Hollywood system, yet was legally obligated to act like a clown for 14 hours a day. Trapped in this physical and linguistic cage, entirely isolated from her homeland, the vibrant artist from Lapa began to fracture. By the summer of 1940, Carmen Miranda had been away from Brazil for a little over a year, but in the accelerated timeline of Hollywood fame, it felt like a lifetime. She had fundamentally conquered the American entertainment industry. She had starred in a smash hit Broadway revue, secured a highly lucrative contract with 20th Century Fox, and her face was splashed across magazines and newspapers from New York to Los Angeles. She had become a millionaire. In her mind, the time was right to return home. She booked passage on a ship back to Rio de Janeiro, entirely convinced that she was returning as a conqueree, nung hero. She believed she had successfully exported Brazilian culture to the biggest, most profitable stage on the planet. She expected a triumphant homecoming, a celebration of the local girl who had taken on the American giants and won. She packed her trunks with expensive American clothes and prepared to present her new, highly polished Hollywood act to the people who had first made her a star. But Carmen Miranda was completely insulated from the political and cultural reality of her homeland. She did not understand how her American success was actually being perceived in the cafes, newspapers, and political offices of Rio de Janeiro. Brazil was operating under the Estado Novo, a highly nationalistic authoritarian regime led by President Getúlio Vargas. The cultural atmosphere was fiercely protective of Brazilian identity. While the government officially cooperated with the United States good neighbor policy for economic and military reasons, the Brazilian elite and the intellectual class harbored a deep, lingering suspicion of American cultural imperialism. They were terrified of being swallowed whole by the massive, wealthy, and ignorant machinery of the United States. They had been watching Miranda's American career unfold with growing horror. They saw the promotional posters. They read the American reviews that called her a savage and a jungle beauty. They saw the photographs of the towering, ridiculous fruit hats and the platform shoes. To the Brazilian public, the Baiana outfit was not a joke. It was a respected traditional garment worn by the Afro-Brazilian women of Bahia. It was a symbol of national heritage. 20th Century Fox had taken that symbol, mutated it into a cheap neon-colored clown suit, and plastered it across American cinema screens. The Brazilian intellectual class felt profoundly insulted. They felt that Hollywood was telling the rest of the world that Brazil was nothing more than a backward tropical banana republic pop, elated by hyperactive, simple-minded people. And worst of all, they felt that Carmen Miranda, their most beloved, talented star, had willingly sold them out for American dollars. She had become complicit in the mockery of her own nation. This was the hostile, highly combustible cultural environment Miranda sailed into. When her ship arrived at the docks in Rio de Janeiro on July 10, 1940, there was a massive crowd waiting for her. Initially, the reception seemed warm, driven by the sheer curiosity of the working-class public who still remembered the girl from the Lapa district. But the true test of her return was scheduled for a few nights later. She was booked to perform a highly publicized exclusive charity concert at the Urca Casino. The Urca Casino was the undisputed epicenter of Brazilian high society. It was a massive, glamorous venue frequented by politicians, wealthy industrialists, international diplomats, and the sharpest, most ruthless cultural critics in the country. It was the exact room she had dominated just 2 years prior. On the night of July 15, 1940, the room was packed to capacity. The audience was dressed in formal evening wear. The atmosphere was incredibly tense. They were not there just to be entertained. They were there to inspect her. They wanted to see exactly what America had done to their dictator of samba. Carmen Miranda stepped out onto the stage, completely misreading the room. She did not walk out as the sophisticated, authentic Brazilian artist they remembered. She walked out fully inhabited by the Hollywood caricature. She was wearing the exaggerated, hyper-colored Hollywood version of the Baiana dress. She bounded to the microphone with the manic, frantic energy 20th Century Fox had trained her to project. And then she made a fatal, irreversible miscalculation. She greeted the Brazilian audience in English. She shouted, "Good evening, people," to a room full of fiercely nationalistic Brazilians. She then began her musical set by performing her American hits, backed by arrangements that had been heavily altered to suit the tastes of white American audiences. The complex driving rhythm of the authentic samba had been smoothed out, slowed down, and commercialized. The reaction from the audience was immediate, physical, and brutal. The Urca Casino, typically a venue filled with loud applause and dancing, descended into an icy, terrifying silence. The high society crowd stared at her with open contempt. The silence was quickly broken, but not by applause. A low murmur rippled through the tables, rapidly escalating into outright hostility. The audience began to aggressively boo her. Men in expensive suits and women in evening gowns stood up and jeered. They shouted insults at the stage. They called her a sellout. They accused her of turning their culture into a circus act. It was a total, unmitigated rejection. They were not just rejecting her performance. They were rejecting her entirely. They were telling her that she no longer belonged to them. For a performer who thrived on the energy and love of her audience, the backlash was a physical blow. Miranda faltered. The manic Hollywood smile vanished from her face. The sheer volume of the hatred radiating from her own people shattered her completely. She could not finish the set. Humiliated, terrified, and utterly broken, she turned her back on the audience and fled the stage. She ran into her dressing room and collapsed. Eyewitness accounts from that night describe a scene of absolute devastation. She wept uncontrollably, tearing at the heavy artificial costume that she now realized was a symbol of her own treason. She was inconsolable. The psychological foundation she had built her life upon had just been violently ripped away. She thought she was bringing glory to Brazil, but the people she loved most had just looked her in the eye and told her she was an embarrassment. The media fallout the next morning was merciless. The Brazilian newspapers, heavily influenced by the nationalist government, published scathing reviews of the concert. They tore her apart, criticizing her Americanized mannerisms, her bastardized music, and her sheer audacity to speak English to a Brazilian crowd. Miranda retreated into complete isolation. She canceled all her remaining scheduled performances at the Urca Casino. She locked herself in her hotel room for over a month, refusing to see anyone. She fell into a deep, crushing depression. The reality of her situation was finally clear to her, and it was a living nightmare. She was trapped between two worlds, and neither of them saw her as a human being. In the United States, she was a highly profitable, two-dimensional joke, legally forbidden from being smart or authentic. In Brazil, she was a traitor, a woman who had traded her national soul for Hollywood money. She had no home left. She was an exile, locked inside a corporate persona that she could not escape. 2 months later, in a desperate final attempt to explain herself to her people, she returned to a recording studio in Rio de Janeiro. She recorded a samba titled Disseram que voltei americanizada. The lyrics were a direct, passionate response to her critics. She sang that she still carried Brazil in her heart, that she still knew how to dance the true samba, and that she would never trade the rhythm of her homeland for the wealth of America. It was a beautiful, heartbreaking plea for forgiveness. But it was too late. The record sold well, but the cultural damage was permanent. The pristine relationship she had once enjoyed with her country was forever fractured. When her leave of absence ended, she was contractually obligated to return to Los Angeles. She packed her bags and boarded a plane back to the United States. She left Brazil carrying a heavy, unresolved grief that would never leave her. She knew that she was returning to the sound stages of 20th Century Fox, returning to the massive fruit hats, the 8-inch platform shoes, and the phonetically mangled scripts. She had lost her country, her dignity, and her authenticity. The deep psychological despair caused by this cultural exile created an unbearable internal agony. And as she stepped back onto the Hollywood studio lots, the corporate executives did not care about her broken heart. They only cared that she was ready to film her next picture. They demanded that the Brazilian Bombshell return to the screen, smiling wider and dancing harder than ever before. To force a woman who was actively drowning in depression to maintain that level of manic artificial joy required drastic, highly dangerous measures. Fox was preparing to move beyond psychological manipulation and physical discomfort. They were about to introduce a new, lethal tool to ensure their most profitable property kept dancing. They were about to turn her biology against her. When Carmen Miranda returned to Los Angeles in the late summer of 1940, she was a fundamentally altered human being. The disastrous reception at the Urca Casino in Rio de Janeiro had gutted her. The country she loved had publicly rejected her, branding her a corporate sellout who had allowed American studios to turn their rich cultural heritage into a humiliating joke. She carried this profound, heavy grief back to the sound stages of 20th Century Fox. But the Hollywood machinery did not possess the capacity for empathy. The studio executives did not care about her broken heart or her cultural exile. They only cared about the production schedule. She was instructed to report to the wardrobe department, strap on the 8-inch platform shoes, balance the towering artificial fruit hat on her head, and step in front of the blinding Technicolor cameras. The director called for action. The script demanded that the Brazilian Bombshell explode onto the screen with a manic, hyperactive, unyielding joy. The grief was slowing her down, and her signature smile failed to reach her eyes. The chronic, agonizing joint pain from the platform shoes was becoming impossible to mask, Studio executives watched the daily film rushes and recognized a direct threat to their investment. Instead of offering a reprieve, they deployed a ruthless medical intervention to force her biology to comply. The 1940s studio system operated its own shadow medical infrastructure. Studio-affiliated doctors were routinely deployed to the sound stages to ensure the highly paid actors kept working regardless of their physical condition. When Carmen Miranda complained of profound exhaustion and sadness, the doctors did not diagnose her with depression. They offered her vitamin shots and prescription pills to help her pep up. These were not benign health supplements. The doctors were prescribing massive, unregulated doses of amphetamines. Amphetamines are powerful central nervous system stimulants. When injected or ingested, they flood the brain with artificial dopamine, rapidly accelerating the heart rate, elevating blood pressure, and completely overriding the body's natural signals of fatigue. For a woman suffering from deep emotional despair and severe physical pain, the initial introduction to these drugs must have felt like a miracle. Within minutes of taking the pills, the heavy, suffocating weight of her depression would vanish. The chronic pain in her feet and spine was suddenly manageable. She felt electric, invincible, and euphoric. Under the influence of amphetamines, she could dance in the heavy costumes for 14 hours straight. She could deliver her phonetically mangled lines with the frantic, wide-eyed enthusiasm the directors demanded. The studio executives were thrilled. Their Bombshell was back, functioning at maximum profitability. But amphetamines do not cure exhaustion. They merely defer it, accumulating a massive physiological debt that the body must eventually pay. When the director finally called cut and she returned to her Beverly Hills mansion, the drugs did not simply switch off. Her heart would continue to race wildly in her chest. Her mind would spin with drug-induced paranoia and severe anxiety. She would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling for hours, completely unable to shut down her overstimulated nervous system. The artificial high was inevitably followed by a crushing, desperate psychological crash. To solve the insomnia caused by the amphetamines, the studio doctors introduced the second phase of her chemical imprisonment. They prescribed powerful barbiturates, heavy central nervous system depressants designed to knock her out. She was now locked into a lethal daily chemical seesaw. She relied on the uppers to wake her up, numb her physical pain, and manufacture the manic smile the studio demanded. Then, she relied on the downers to force her racing heart to slow down enough so she could achieve a few hours of chemically induced unconsciousness, only to wake up the next morning and start the brutal cycle all over again. This pharmaceutical regimen was a direct assault on her cardiovascular system. The human heart is a muscle, and for years she was whipping it like a racehorse with stimulants, then slamming on the brakes with heavy sedatives. The physical toll was immense. She began to suffer from severe weight loss, chronic heart palpitations, and terrifying mood swings. But the studio did not intervene to save her. As long as she hit her marks on the soundstage, the doctors kept writing the prescriptions. 20th Century Fox had successfully replaced her authentic soul with a highly volatile chemical engine. As she entered her late 30s, the profound isolation of her existence became unbearable. She was surrounded by managers, studio publicists, and hangers-on, but she was entirely alone. Her romantic life had been strictly managed by the studio, who preferred their exotic star to remain single and available in the public imagination. Desperate for a genuine connection, a sense of stability, and an ally to help her navigate the ruthless Hollywood ecosystem, she made a catastrophic personal decision. In 1947, she met and quickly married an American film producer named David Sebastian. To the outside world, it looked like the perfect Hollywood ending. But David Sebastian was not a lifeline. He was an anchor. He was an incredibly minor figure in the film industry, possessing very little actual talent or influence of his own. What he did possess was a sharp, opportunistic eye. He looked at Carmen Miranda and saw exactly what 20th Century Fox saw: a highly lucrative asset. Almost immediately after the wedding, Sebastian declared himself her sole manager and business representative. He aggressively isolated her from her previous advisors and took total control of her massive financial portfolio. The marriage was a disaster from the beginning. Accounts from her close friends and band members describe Sebastian as emotionally abusive, deeply controlling, and financially incompetent. He began making terrible high-risk investments with her television and film earnings, rapidly squandering the fortune she had sacrificed her physical and mental health to build. Furthermore, the geopolitical landscape that had created her Hollywood career was shifting. By the late 1940s, the Second World War was over. The European film markets had reopened to American studios. The United States government no longer needed the good neighbor policy, and consequently, 20th Century Fox no longer needed Carmen Miranda. The era of the heavily funded South American-themed Technicolor musical was coming to an end. The studio eventually bought out the remainder of her contract, effectively discarding her the moment she was no longer politically useful. She was finally free of the studio executives, but she was now entirely trapped by her husband. To fund his lavish lifestyle and cover the massive losses from his poor investments. Sebastian forced her to transition from the film's sound stages to the live nightclub circuit. If the studio system was a prison, the live performance circuit of the 1950s was a gladiatorial arena. Sebastian booked her on grueling, relentless tours across the United States, Europe, and Cuba. She was required to perform live, high-impact shows multiple times a night, forced back into the same crippling wardrobe that had already ravaged her body. To survive this punishing schedule, her reliance on the chemical seesaw spiraled completely out of control. The dosages of amphetamines required to get her onto the stage doubled. She was terrified of failing, terrified of forgetting her lyrics, and terrified of the husband who stood in the wings, demanding that she keep dancing to pay their mounting debts. She was a woman in her 40s, her body ravaged by over a decade of orthopedic strain and heavy narcotics, being driven like a machine. The breaking point arrived in late 1954, while performing a grueling residency in a nightclub in Ohio. Her biological engine finally seized. The years of carrying the heavy fruit hats, the agonizing pain of the platform shoes, the toxic marriage, the deep cultural exile, and the massive daily intake of barbiturates and amphetamines culminated in a catastrophic physical and mental collapse. She began experiencing severe paranoia, profound memory loss, and a terrifying, unshakable physical exhaustion. She could not stand up. She could not remember the lyrics to the songs she had sung 1,000 times. The chemical facade had completely shattered. Her American doctors warned Sebastian that if she did not stop working immediately, she would die. Faced with the undeniable reality of her collapse, she finally fled the United States. In late 1954, she returned to Brazil not for a triumphant concert, but seeking a desperate medical sanctuary. She checked into a hotel in Rio de Janeiro, hiding from the public eye. She was a fragile, trembling ghost of the vibrant woman who had left the country 15 years earlier. The Brazilian medical establishment, however, was ill-equipped to handle the complex realities of severe, long-term pharmaceutical addiction, compounded by deep clinical depression. They viewed her condition through the primitive psychiatric lens of the 1950s. They did not offer her a slow, careful detoxification program or nuanced psychological therapy. To treat her profound nervous exhaustion, they authorized one of the most brutal, invasive psychiatric treatments available at the time, electroconvulsive therapy. The reality of electroshock therapy in the mid-1950s was a horrifying ordeal. Without the sophisticated muscle relaxants and precise dosing used in modern medicine, ECT was a violently traumatic procedure. They strapped the highest-paid female entertainer in American history to a hospital bed, placed electrodes on her temples, and passed raw electrical currents directly through her brain to intentionally induce massive grand mal seizures. The theoretical goal of this procedure was to reset the brain's chemistry. The actual result was devastating psychological trauma. The electrical shocks violently disrupted her neural pathways. When she awoke from the treatments, she was deeply disoriented and terrified. The procedure caused significant, terrifying memory loss. The woman whose entire career was built on her ability to memorize and deliver complex, rapid-fire, syncopated lyrics suddenly found herself struggling to remember basic conversations or the words to her own songs. The electroshock did not cure her depression or her chemical dependency. It simply added profound neurological trauma to an already shattered mind. She spent several months in Brazil, slowly trying to piece her fractured memory back together. She was surrounded by her family, and for a brief moment it seemed she might finally escape the machine that had destroyed her. Her doctors in Rio explicitly advised her to retire, warning her that her cardiovascular system was severely compromised and that returning to the high-stress environment of the American entertainment industry would be fatal. But the trap she had built with David Sebastian was inescapable. While she was recovering from the electrical trauma to her brain, the bills in Beverly Hills were piling up. Sebastian was relentlessly pressuring her to return. He reminded her of the outstanding contracts, the television appearances they had booked, and the massive financial obligations he had accumulated in her name. He weaponized her profound sense of duty and her fear of financial ruin. In April 1955, driven by Sebastian's pressure and looming debts, she ignored her Brazilian doctor's desperate warnings. She boarded a flight back to Los Angeles, stepping directly onto the punishing sound stages of 1950s broadcast television. But she was completely trapped. Her husband, David Sebastian, had severely mismanaged her fortune, accumulating massive debts and locking her into legally binding performance contracts. He did not see a fragile 46-year-old woman recovering from severe neurological and physical trauma. He saw an overdue invoice that needed to be paid. The Hollywood she returned to had shifted. The era of the massive big-budget Technicolor musical had faded, replaced by the rapid, relentless demands of the new medium, broadcast television. Television production in the mid-1950s was a grueling, high-pressure environment. It was fast, it was cheap, and it demanded absolute, immediate perfection from its performers. There was no time for the multiple takes or the protective lighting of the film studios. To meet the demands of this punishing new schedule and to mask the terrifying memory gaps caused by the electroshock therapy, the lethal pharmaceutical cycle immediately resumed. She was terrified of forgetting her lyrics or missing a cue on live-to-tape broadcasts. To force her exhausted, traumatized brain to focus and to manufacture the frantic, hyper-energetic Brazilian bombshell persona that the television producers demanded, she was plunged right back into, the amphetamine dependency. The physical toll of returning to the stimulants was catastrophic. Her heart had already endured 15 years of heavy orthopedic strain, extreme stress, and chemical abuse. It was a muscle pushed to its absolute breaking point, starved of proper rest and continually shocked by artificial adrenaline. She was a woman in her late 40s, possessing the internal organs of someone decades older, entirely reliant on a cocktail of uppers and downers just to get out of bed in the morning. By August 1955, the physical debt she owed her own biology was finally called in. She was booked to appear on The Jimmy Durante Show, a highly popular, fast-paced television variety program. Jimmy Durante was a notoriously loud physical comedian, and the producers expected Carmen Miranda to match his manic energy frame for frame. She was assigned a vigorous, high-impact dance routine. Despite her failing heart, she was required to wear the extreme heavy costumes that had defined her corporate caricature for 15 years. The filming took place on the evening of August 4th, 1955. The surviving footage of this broadcast is one of the most harrowing, disturbing historical documents in the archives of American television. It is the visual record of a corporate machine working a human being to death in real time. As the cameras rolled, Miranda and Durante engaged in a rapid, highly choreographed comedic dance number. She was smiling her massive signature smile, moving with frantic energy, delivering the exact caricature 20th Century Fox had engineered 15 years earlier. But inside her chest, a massive, catastrophic biological failure was occurring. Midway through the routine, while dancing energetically across the stage. Her heart simply gave out. The footage shows her suddenly faltering. The kinetic energy leaves her body entirely. She drops heavily to her knees, breathless, clutching her chest. Her face, beneath the heavy layers of studio makeup, becomes visibly pale and stricken. In a normal, humane environment, a medical emergency of this magnitude would stop the production instantly. Paramedics would be called, but the Hollywood conditioning was absolute, and the live studio audience did not understand what they were witnessing. Because her entire brand was built on physical comedy and frantic, exaggerated movements, the audience thought her collapse was part of the act. They laughed. Jimmy Durante, standing next to her, immediately realized it was not a joke. He saw the sheer terror in her eyes and helped her back to her feet. She leaned heavily against him, gasping for air, and managed to say, "I'm all out of breath." What happened next is the ultimate, horrifying testament to the psychological prison she inhabited. She was actively experiencing a massive coronary event. Her heart muscle was dying, starved of oxygen. The pain must have been excruciating, but the studio had trained her that the show must go on at all costs. She had been conditioned to believe that her physical suffering was irrelevant, that her only value was her ability to entertain the American public. She did not ask for a doctor. She did not stop the take. She forced her failing, dying heart to pump. She stood upright. She flashed her manic, wide-eyed smile for the cameras. She threw her arms in the air, finished the complex dance routine, and waved cheerfully to the audience as the scene ended. She delivered the punchline while her body was shutting down. The moment the director yelled "cut," the facade crumbled. She stumbled off the stage and collapsed in her dressing room. Despite suffering a severe heart attack on stage, the tragic momentum of her life could not be halted. The culture of the 1950s entertainment industry was incredibly dismissive of performers' health. Rather than being rushed to a hospital, she was allowed to go home. In an act of profound, heartbreaking professionalism, she actually hosted a small wrap party for T.I. He cast and crew at her Beverly Hills mansion that same night. She played the role of the perfect, gracious hostess, smiling and serving drinks to her guests, entirely masking the lethal physical crisis happening inside her own body. In the early hours of August 5th, 1955, after the guests had finally left and her husband had gone to sleep, the final blow arrived. She went upstairs to her bedroom, removed the heavy stage makeup, and walked into her hallway. She suffered a second, massive, and final heart attack. She collapsed onto the floor holding a small mirror in her hand. She was found dead the next morning. She was only 46 years old. The news of her death triggered a massive wave of public mourning across the United States. The exact same studio executives and managers who had mocked her intelligence, bound her in painful costumes, and supplied her with amphetamines now wept publicly for their Brazilian bombshell. They mourned the loss of a revenue stream, entirely blind to their direct complicity in her destruction. The true scale of the tragedy was only revealed when her body was flown back to Rio de Janeiro. The resentment from 15 years earlier evaporated. Over 500,000 people lined the streets to follow her funeral procession. The working-class citizens of Lapa wept openly. They finally understood the immense sacrifice she had made, realizing too late that she had not sold them out. She had been taken hostage by a foreign corporate machine, chewed up and spat out. Today, the iconic image of Carmen Miranda, the bright colors, the towering fruit hats, the wide smile, is still casually utilized as a symbol of tropical festivity. But to look at that image and see only a comedic fashion statement is to fall for an 80-year-old lie. Carmen Miranda was a musical genius and a fiercely independent artist. That costume was a highly constructed corporate prison. She broke down massive international barriers, but the Hollywood machine forced her to dance under the weight of that racist caricature until the exact second her heart stopped beating.